So our next speaker is Sean Ellis, and he helped in the early days of Dropbox and Eventbrite and many other companies that somehow hit that amazing S-curve and grew. And he's going to share with us his top 10 habits of high-growth startups. So please give a nice round of applause to Sean Ellis.
Thank you, Eric. So hi, everyone. So startups today, I mean, Okta is just a great example of, there are so many fast-growing startups today. It seems like they're growing faster than ever before. And some of them are doing it without even spending money on growth and advertising. I mean, they're spending money on growth, but not necessarily advertising. And so regardless of the channels that they're using, what I found in my own experience and in studying other companies is that they all tend to share a common set of habits that lead to this growth. And so that's what I'm going to be taking us through today. So Eric went through some of my background of companies that I've worked with. I worked at 2 companies from launch to an IPO filing where I ran marketing at those companies. And in other companies, what I did is I went in the early days and tried to establish some of the habits that I'll talk about today. And then I've also, with the growthhackers.com team, studied 20 of the fastest growing companies out there and really tried to find the commonalities. And that's a lot of what today is going to be about. This presentation is going to be about the habits that those companies do every day to drive growth. And I think if you study those habits and try to apply them to your own business, that you'll find that you'll be growing at a much better pace than you would otherwise. So start with the first one, which is really based on, so it's word for word taken from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey's book. And it's about putting first things first. And so it's really making sure that your product is worthy of growth in the first place. If your product's not worthy of growth, then you can have all the habits in the world, and it's not going to grow very well. So how do you get there? What do you actually do to make it worthy of growth? You start engaging prospects and customers from day one. You start really spending the time to figure out, don't worry about the big scalable growth programs. Worry about just what are their needs? Are you meeting their needs? Do you have the right product for the right market? And you're really working your way toward getting to this product market fit. It's a lot of hard work. It's not sort of sitting behind and just working the numbers. It's about getting out in front of people, engaging on a regular basis. And if you can get product market fit, that builds the foundation for long-term growth that's critical for ultimately being able to scale growth in the business. And so the next habit is pretty similar, which is companies that are fast-growing tend to be really curious about their customers. They tend to want to know everything about them. So why would someone want to try my product in the first place? That's a question that I think a lot of people fail to ask, but it's important. And once they've tried it, who loves it? Who doesn't really care that much about it? And when you can dig into that information, you can start to really figure out what are the types of customers that I ultimately need to get my product into the hands of. And I have one company who we went through this process in the early days, and it's a company worth billions of dollars today. And when I first went in and started to engage with their early customers, it was clear that most of them didn't consider the product a must-have. Most of them considered it a nice-to-have. In fact, less than 10% of the early users considered it a must-have. And I knew that was not enough to really build a scalable growth engine on top of that kind of user passion. But fortunately, the users who considered it a must-have all used it in a similar way, all focused on the same benefit. They had a pretty narrow use case that some of the other users didn't have. And so what we were able to do was reposition the product based on the narrower set of benefits and use cases. And the next cohort of people who went through, within a few weeks, we had about an 8x increase in the number of people who considered the product a must-have. And that was really critical for being able to build that growth. And so it wasn't just a matter of improving the product. The product was good already, but it was about figuring out who was it right for, why was it right for them, and really, really honing in on that and positioning it correctly for those people. And so curiosity about customers and really figuring out what makes them tick is a critical habit for driving growth in any business. The next habit is instrumenting powerful analytics. Most companies today know that they need to have a very clear picture of what's happening on their website. There's just no reason to guess today about what people are doing when there's really good analytic solutions that are out there. So Google Analytics is good, but the fact is you also want to know at various states, where are people in the funnel? You want to know what they're doing over multiple sessions and some things that are a little harder for Google Analytics to give you. In the past, it used to take months to implement the right tracking for me to see that information. So in the early days at Dropbox, it took a long time to implement it, and Eventbrite at LogMeIn, it probably took us 3 or 4 months to get the analytics right. Today, with products like Mixpanel or Kissmetrics, you can do it in a matter of hours. So companies that who really use the information that's available to them to make better decisions and to understand what's working, what's not working, are in a lot better position to grow their businesses. So the next habit is really built on what do you do with those analytics. So when you know what's working and what's not working, how do you act on that information, fix the things that aren't working, and double down on the things that are working. And so the fastest growing companies are relentless about conversion rate optimization. They understand that you really have kind of 2 key levers when it comes to driving conversions. One is you can increase the desire for your product and drive more momentum as people are coming in to try it. And the other is you can figure out the things that prevent them from trying it. So what are their concerns? What are the points of confusion? What are anything that creates friction in trying a product? If you can address those things, you will increase the number of people who ultimately get in and use the product and use it correctly. So improve the desire, reduce the friction, and you'll get more people using the product. If you don't do this and you try to grow, it's like trying to run a marathon with sandbags tied to you. It's growth without optimal conversions is really tough. So the best companies are doing this. You should do this as well, and you'll find that I can give you a specific example. At LogMeIn, we originally tried to grow the business without doing much conversion rate optimization. And if anyone knows LogMeIn, it's a remote control software for a computer. And if you actually look at the onboarding process, it's pretty complicated. You have to sign up for the product. You have to download the product. You have to install the product. Sometimes you have to configure firewalls. And kind of at each one of those steps, we were losing people. And ultimately, the point that everybody says it was worth it was once they go to another computer, remote in, and then they say, oh, OK, I get it. This is great. And so for every 100 people who signed up for the product, only a couple were actually using the product. And I was trying to grow that business. It was nearly impossible. But once we actually stepped back, spent about 4 months really being focused on conversion rate optimization, we got about 10x the number of people who started the process to actually go in and do a remote control session. The same set of channels that we had previously tested that scaled to maybe $10,000 a month in spending, we could now spend over $1 million on those channels because some of them didn't work at all before. After we increased the conversion rates, they worked much better. So conversion rate optimization is a really important habit for fast-growing companies. Now we'll get into sort of more of the cadence of a lot of this was kind of leading up to how do you start the growth process. How do you manage the growth process is really important. And the fastest-growing companies have turned growth into a team sport that either is part of a growth team or maybe even is the entire company. And the entire company, I think, is the ideal solution where everybody is participating in growth. And so if you can source ideas from the entire company about tests to run, and you're going to find that ideas that come from a support team are going to be very different. They're going to be much more based on empathy and an understanding of customers' needs on a pretty intimate level. And then ideas that come from an engineering team are going to be much more based on sort of what are the possibilities and how do you really stretch the limits on things. And the deeper your repository of ideas, the more things that you're going to be able to choose from when you're running tests. But in order to get people to participate in that process, you need to open it up and be fully transparent to people about all the things that you've tried and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And without that transparency, you're not going to get people participating in the process. But once you do get them participating, you'll find that that's a really powerful way to start driving growth and building a culture around growth. So it was interesting. Last night, I saw two people from the Dropbox team presenting on some of their growth processes, and it was great to hear them emphasizing like transparency and getting the whole team to participate. And those were all things that we worked on 5-6 years ago, 2008, whenever that was, and I guess 7 years ago. And it's great to be able to see that that's become part of their culture and part of the habits of growth that they still have today. So once you get ideas, then you obviously need to experiment on those ideas. You should never just implement something with the assumption that it's going to work right out of the gate, because you'll be surprised that more often than not, the things you expect to work don't, and the things you don't expect to work do, and the only way to know is to run it as an experiment. And if you have a lot of ideas and you're running experiments on those ideas, you're going to learn how to grow a business. And the best companies are running lots of experiments. And so you want to make sure that you run them across all of the levers of growth, not just acquisition that traditionally fits in the marketing team, but things like retention and revenue. And the more that you can run experiments on each of those, you'll find that you're going to figure out more and better ways to grow the business, and they'll add up together. And as you find those winning experiments and communicate them back to the company, people will get more invested in the process and get excited about growth. So, I mean, one thing that was really interesting with Dropbox on that front was that after I left Dropbox, it was an initial 6-month kind of interim role. They didn't even have a marketer on the team or a growth person on the team for another year after that, but they continued at the same pace to run experiments because it was deep within their culture to do that. And they're one of the last teams to really form, one of the last kind of big companies to really form a growth team in the fast-growing Silicon Valley companies. And part of the reason why they didn't need to do it for a long time is because it is so kind of core to their culture. So that's ultimately the goal. This is a challenge that I think most marketers who've ever tried to do an engineering initiative that requires some engineering resources find that it's really hard to get the resources to do that. And the companies that are growing really quickly have prioritized resources to do it. So ideally, they've done it in a way that they've got an autonomous growth team where they actually have dedicated resources that are just dedicated to running marketing experiments. But if not, making them available, because those experiments are just critical for being able to accelerate growth. So what I've found in the past when I've tried to do this is it's not enough to just have the skill on a team that's responsible for growth. The people actually need to have permission to work on core product and deep website pages and that sort of thing. So it's about having skills that are prioritized, about permission for those skills. But when you do that, you're in a position to actually run the experiments that will lead to growth. And the best fast-growing companies have really prioritized the resources to support growth. And it's not just about running an occasional experiment. It's about doing it at an extremely high tempo. And so that's the next habit is the fastest growing companies are very high tempo about their testing. They're setting goals each week. They're hitting those goals. They have a process that supports a high tempo. So they've got a process that brings in ideas, that helps them prioritize and manage tests, keeps them in a knowledge base, but ultimately they're equipped both from a process and a tool set perspective to actually manage a lot of tests on a frequent basis. The most that I've seen is HubSpot's got a Sidekick as one of their products, a CRM product that they've launched within the last couple of years, and they do 30 experiments per week. And so you can imagine that that kind of tempo is one that requires a lot of process and instrumentation to pull off. But when you do that, what you're going to find is that some wins are going to be just little tiny wins, but those little wins add up, and each one makes your trajectory for growth a little bit steeper, and then occasionally you're going to get big wins, and it's really hard to predict. So a lot of times the things that I think are going to work really well don't end up working that well, and things that I just get really surprised. So for example, one test that we recently ran on growthhackers.com was something that we gauged the impact. We thought on a scale of 1 to 10 that it would be about a 4, and it took only an hour to implement. And it was just moving, or less than an hour to implement, just moving an email collector from the bottom of a page to the top of a page. But it increased our email collection by 700%. And so that one test was huge, but it took 10 tests for us to actually come up with one that was going to be really big. So it's that high tempo becomes really important. So the next habit is accountability for the inputs. It's really common for people to have accountability for the outputs for a marketing team, but the inputs is ultimately what you can control. It's easy to say, okay, we're going to grow 20% a month, and if we don't do that, we'll just fire the marketing team and have the next group come in and try to do it. But if you say you're going to grow 20% a month, that's great, but then you have to think about what do we need to do in order to grow 20% a month. So how many experiments are we going to need to run? Where are we getting the growth from today? What's the expectation of that working? How many experiments are we going to run? Who's going to come up with the ideas for experiments? How are we going to keep that throughput of ideas happening? Who's going to actually be responsible for implementing each experiment when that doesn't happen? How do we hold them accountable? And so this is something we do internally where on my team, I put a screenshot every week onto Slack that says, here's who came up with the most ideas, growth ideas this week, and we have a new leader, so we'll run a leaderboard internally just to make sure that we're celebrating the people who are coming up with good ideas for growth. And then the last habit that fast-growing companies have is that they double down on success. So the best place to find something that's going to be effective is squeezing more out of something that's already been effective. So what you want to do when something's successful, when you run a test and it's successful, you want to reverse engineer that test and try to understand what was it that made that successful. You want to make sure that you communicate that information out across the company because it starts to train people to think about how are we actually growing, what works, what doesn't work, and the more that people are plugged into what's working, one, they'll celebrate the process of testing, but two, they'll come up with better ideas that are more tied to what actually is effective and what's important. So one time with this idea of doubling down, I kind of took it, I think, a little too broadly. It was in the early days of Google, and we had gotten a lot of growth out of Google, and so I said, search is where we're going to get the growth from, and we then decided we're going to look at all of the search engines. And this was before Google quite had the dominance that it does today, but we went out and not only did we go to Yahoo, but we went to these super long-tail search engines, and we spent a couple of months of just trying to maximize that channel because we knew there was a lot of people who were seeking our type of solution, and that search would be a good one for us. But when we stepped back and we didn't get that much of a gain from all of that work, we decided let's just actually spend more time on Google and try to squeeze more growth out of Google. And what had taken sort of 2 or 3 months across this long tail of search engines, we got in a week by just being more focused on Google. So when you double down, make sure that you're doubling down on in a pretty tight way to what's working. So that's the 10 habits. Just kind of look at each of them. And what I recommend is that you basically, like once per week, as you're trying to grow your business, you grade yourself on each of these. And you make sure that you're making progress on each of these. And as long as you've nailed the first one, and you've got a product that's worthy of growth, and you've started to build that foundation of product market fit, then you will accelerate growth if you do each of the others and you're really focused on each of the others. So we're coming up on, maybe I have time for 1 or 2 questions, but hopefully that will get you guys pointed in the right direction on accelerating growth.
Thank you. Well, I have one question. Okay. So a lot of this boils down to kind of test, iterate, experiment, collect data, and then double down on what works, right? Kind of classic lean startup methodology. Mm-hmm. So how do you, when you test what works, what are the marketing metrics that you find to be useful in terms of actually figuring out the ROI of these different channels?
So it really depends where you're running the test. Mm-hmm. So that Dave McClure framework of R is pretty important. And so
what's that?
It's basically acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue are all areas where you can run experiments. So obviously if you're running an experiment in referral, then your success metric is going to be how many more people does each person bring in, and then there's a set of optimizations you can do there, from your prompt to get people to invite others, your landing page that those people come on, your invite.
Right.
So the metrics can be pretty micro or macro.
So one of the big themes that's been coming up again and again today on stage is kind of this, as we have all these self-serve services, products, right, where people kind of find them by word of mouth and they try them out. They don't need permission, whether it's enterprise or consumer, to try it and even to pay for it, right? There's a certain growth rate that's associated with that, and the virality of the product, et cetera. Then there's another whole set of customers who need to be marketed and sold to, so how do you know which to focus on? Because you're getting your best results from the people who kind of come to your product naturally.
Mm-hmm. So I would be testing. So anything that's beyond the acquisition lever, so external channels, kind of more traditional marketing, is affected by, so acquisition is affected by improvements on all of the other levers. So if I double my revenue per person, I can spend twice as much on acquisition. So if I'm working revenue and upsells and SaaS retention, that's all going to improve my ability to spend money on customer acquisition. Same thing with conversions. If I double the percentage of people who hit my website who ultimately sign up for a trial, then I'm going to double what I can pay on acquiring people. Or if it's an organic channel, then I'm going to double the effectiveness of that organic channel. So each of these things, that ultimately the fastest growing companies tend to have organic as a very big component of their growth. Mm-hmm. And that organic engine that's spinning up is fed from a lot of inbound channels. So whether they're paid channels or different experiments that you're doing, just gets it spinning faster, and that's really what you're shooting for.
Terrific. Well, thanks for sharing all these new methods with us. I'm sure everyone in the room will put them into operations. Big round of applause for Sean Ellis. Thank you.
Thanks.